Hi everyone, Paul from the Data Storytellers here. Today I'm here with Manuel Neumann, who's the Global Head of Data Science for Red Bull. Great to have you with us.
Hey Paul, thank you for having me on the show. Very much looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, so for those members who don't know you, just tell us a bit about yourself in a few words to start.
Sure. So I've been leading now the data science practice at Red Bull for about 7 years. Before that, I was a disgruntled economist, you could say. Did an MBA before that, worked in various roles in consulting, risk consulting, and really kind of made this decision to become, let's say, a professional in this space, kind of, without a real plan, to be quite frank. And it just turned out to be a good decision. As I said, 7 years ago when I joined my current employer, where I would say I became a professional in this data science and AI space, or data space in general. I think that's the most important thing you really need to know about myself. Again, many colors to my career, definitely clearly defined career path. Many things happened by coincidence, you could ask, or luck or preparation, who knows, but I'm very happy that I am today where I am.
And you touched on it briefly there, but your background is as an economist, and you said the word disgruntled. So I'm keen to kind of dig in as to how you came into the data science world.
No, that's of course fair enough. So what I meant by that is I did work. So I think my claim to fame in the data science space is really when I worked as an applied an economist or a macroeconomist, econometrician in the past. And this is really where, let's say, I had my most technical exposure, I would say, to data science. And at the time when I finished basically working for that consultancy, I did came to a realization that there are certain limitations, of course, as well, when it comes to forecasting, especially, and data to really be good at this. And it was more about not who is more right, but who is less wrong in that sense. So I had the feeling in this stage of my life, also like really thinking about working as an economist, where I felt like maybe it's a good time for a change. That's also when I decided to do an MBA. That's what you do when you don't know what to do. You do an MBA. By the way, not a good decision. You should know why you're doing it. But joking aside, I actually decided to really leave the data space for a while, for a couple of years, worked in a commercial role. It was really then when my current employer reached out to me, who was a client of mine in the past, who really came really to me, approached me with I would say, real vision of what they wanted to do, not necessarily really knowing what this space will do or what this kind of these new skills can do for, and we can talk about this maybe later, a non-digital native company like ours. But it was really like the willingness to really have a look at this thoroughly and invest in it, and really build this up more from scratch, and really as a cross-functional initiative, to really see what data science and I could do for our organization. That is really what then changed my mind, when it really wasn't about a very, let's say, vertical application, but really more a general vision of what data could potentially do, or more advanced analytics could do for our organization. That really got me interested and kind of made me also like go back closer again to data, but also really more from an, let's say, transformational enablement point of view. And that's where kind of then I left my gruntleness behind, and really again invested my, let's say, my last 7 years really into this space. And again, it was a really good choice, because at the time, maybe 7-8 years ago, data science wasn't such a big thing yet. It was just starting really to become popular. So I think I made a good call then, because of course since then, in the last years, a lot of things have changed. Yeah.
And 7 years is a long time in the 21st century. So that must mean that you're enjoying yourself. What do you really enjoy about working in data science, and also working in data science with Red Bull specifically?
Sure. So I really think, and I think this is really important to clarify, like when, one has to really kind of distinguish between applying, say, data science and AI in a digital native or a digital non-digital native environment, right? So working for a Google or working maybe for a Walmart, let's put it this way. And I think that is really important, because it, of course, it really changes a lot. I think the kind of roles and people that are needed to really make it ultimately work. And in my personal case, like working in this non-digital native environment, despite the fact that, of course, that I love the brand and the company, it's an Austrian company. As you may know, I'm Austrian as well, so of course it's great to work for one of our iconic companies and brands. But it's really about like this transformational aspect. So it's really for me more about how can we convince basically this maybe sometimes outdated manual processes and really kind of update them to the 21st century using data and technology. That's really what really excited me, to really kind of convince people by showing the value add of these new tools and skills, and really show that you can really make a difference applying them, and that it should become part of our, let's say, really organizational capabilities in the future. And I think that's what really truly excites me, to kind of really show it to the people here that it makes sense to invest in this.
And like you said, we're probably going to talk about this in a bit more detail later on, about the differences between being a digital native versus a non-digital native. And it's probably a pretty good, unique position that you're in, because with Red Bull, it's a brand that's been around for a very long time. It's very strong, but it's not necessarily like a specifically inherently digital company. So from that perspective, how are you going about that transformation? What are some of the things that you're doing to help take Red Bull into that level?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's one also important thing to clarify, like not being digital native is not bad per se, right? It's also just a question of history, right? If you have been found like 50, 60 years ago, then you're just inherently usually non-digital native, right? So there's nothing bad per se about this, and I think there are also like really great examples of companies, non-digital native companies, that really take fantastic advantage of these new opportunities, right? It comes usually with a very different organizational mindset, and also like let's say tech readiness. I would say it this way. But I think what's really really exciting in Red Bull, or I think where the difference is ultimately being made, is really about convincing really decision makers that you're not questioning per se the status quo, as in everything we've done in the past is bad, because clearly in our case it isn't, and we have been very successful in the way we build our company. The processes that we're using have shown to be like really successful at scale. So it's really about finding a narrative to really convince people still, yet even in this kind of successful non-digital native environment, why does it make sense to really invest in these capabilities? And I think this is where I would say the initiative has been successful, because we found that narrative for our organization. And I think this is really what ultimately made the difference, why we're still here, and actually bigger in that sense than ever, and why we're really also having a clear mandate by now, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. And when you use a word like narrative, that's a trigger word for me, because we're the data storytellers, right? In a very general sense, how have you gone about finding that narrative and really, engaging people like that?
That's a good question. I think again, I would love to give as a recommendation, there's a silver bullet how to find that out, but it's not. I think it's fortunately or unfortunately, I think, specific to any organization. Again, it depends on the context. It depends on that readiness, that mindset, where the mandate is coming from. Is it more bottom up? Is it more top down? So I think it really depends. But I think one thing that I learned, and it would be the one, like sharing my experience, is really you need to a certain degree really constantly adapt it, actually, because you may start an initiative like this as in it's just a cool thing to do. Everyone is doing it. You should also do it. But then you very quickly basically switch that narrative once you maybe hit some first golden nuggets, and you see that actually that these projects have been successful with a particular department, so to say. So you really start sharpening that narrative as you go along. And I think for us, it's really ultimately it was to a certain degree really almost deflecting a bit from the complexities of data science and data work, and really focusing more on the let's say on the output that we ultimately generate for key departments in our organization, and really how we just made things just better, but not really focusing too much how cool it is to do data science. Of course, we also had some really great success stories and great just use cases that looked very, very cool. And of course, that helps also in like communication, and people are they like to look at flashy stuff. But it was really ultimately about finding like, what are we actually doing better now because of this, right? And why does it make sense to continue doing that?
It's almost like finding the why, right? And this also ties back in with what you said about it's not necessarily, it isn't a bad thing to not be a digital native. It is what it is. But at the same time, you can actually use those organizations as case studies for not just the best ways to do things, but also where they've tried to implement and failed. And you can also do that with other companies in the non-digital space as well. And adaptation is a key one. What do you think is some of the most important aspects in an organization that allows the preconditions for adaptation?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, I think again, there's so many factors, and it depends ultimately on the organization itself. But I would say the things that come to mind immediately is like there needs to be, of course, someone that really truly believes in this, right? And ideally, that person, the higher and that person's up the hierarchy, I would say, the better. But it doesn't really need to be like like always a CEO mandate at all. It can really also happen by like someone that has enough influence, has enough connections, some access to budget, I would say, very honestly speaking as well, and who can then just start basically this kind of little revolution or transformational process. I think there needs to be one person that believes in that. Then second, there needs to be also like, again, like I would almost call it a bit of luck also in the beginning when you kick this off, like really to hit, let's say, relatively quickly, like your first strike, because that of course then changes the narrative of why you're investing in this anyway, which was also like the case in our history, where it just got a couple of use cases very early on, relatively early on, that just showed from a monetary perspective that it simply makes sense because it was saving a lot of money, therefore no one can argue against it. The third really key pillar, and this is also of course an ongoing evolvement, is of course also the collaboration, as always, with IT. So in our case, just to clarify, like our center of excellence, which again is a cross-functional data science team, we're actually based in the business, and it was also like I think a decision was made on purpose, and I think in our organization was most likely a good one to make. But ultimately, of course, we're also heavily dependent on IT, right? And I think that becomes clearer and clearer also as we mature to kind of continuously bring that value to the organization. So if you have an IT department that is very closely involved, it can also be really actually run out of IT, no problem at all. Again, it depends on the organization and the leadership. But I think that kind of enablement from an IT technology engineering perspective is ultimately also key. So it's really some key decision maker from the business, show value add quickly, and then also having a strong tech support in that sense, that I think are really key pillars. And maybe the ultimate, the one that would throw in there, also given that speaking to data storytellers, is of course also the communication aspect ultimately of that, right? So once you have these first successes, you're gonna have to find this narrative very, very quickly, and in our case, for sure, be able to speak that language in a way that doesn't feel like like that is something challenging or it's a true value add. And maybe it's something to go back to your first to your question just before. What was also important for us to kind of get right was this kind of positioning of what data science does, right? And I can also share this very openly. We position it very quickly as what we call decision support. So it's really not about like replacing people. It's not about like questioning necessarily how things have been done, but it's just about like positioning us as someone who can potentially help you and supporting to make smarter decisions. And I think that helped also a lot, like finding this competitive narrative for existing people, existing roles, and existing processes, but really more of this like kind of value add supporting role, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense, and I've written tons down here, and I think that all those aspects, putting this into a mixing pot and bringing it out, does of course bring across the preconditions for adaptation. But some aspects of this are harder than others. And for example, you mentioned the IT function. I think it's a lot easier to make a case to upgrade the IT than it is to say, here's why you should change your behavior. Here's why, and that's why I think you did a really good job when you mentioned the quick wins, the low hanging fruit that you did, and get those quick use cases in to show the business how that can actually adapt. And you also mentioned leaders as well, which is something we'll delve into. And that one person who's in the organization. So what role does that one person play? Let's say it's a CDO or a global head or whatever that's called. What role does that person play in your opinion? Are they a change agent? Are they an evangelist? Are they, what does that look like for you?
So again, I also want to be careful here because I can only really speak. Of course, I speak to people also in industry, but I feel more comfortable speaking about what I've seen in my organization, and then maybe I can basically talk a bit broader what I think. But I think in our organization was really someone who came with a lot of credibility, with like a long history of being part of the organization, a lot of trust by key decision makers. Because as you can imagine, when you kick something off like this and put some investment behind it, a lot of people just don't understand it, and nor should they, to be frank. So it's really about putting trust in that kind of leader, in that kind of senior person, to kind of what you're doing, and let's give you a bit of space to actually show the value add of that, right? And then I think that person needs to come with ultimately a lot of traits, and it's again like, of course, building on to the trust, but also working on the communication with again, more senior decision makers that ultimately sign off the budget, to kind of keep that conversation going, and really ultimately build like a more sustainable initiative, kind of starting with this trust, but then really build into something that is continuously adding value and is perceived as adding value to the organization. So this person clearly, again, I think trust, communicator, and of course knowing the right people and knowing what to do to influence those people.
And what are some of the best questions to ask to build trust, do you think?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Some of the best questions to build trust. I really think that the one thing that speaks for itself, and this is something that, of course, luckily we did quite early on, is really about the communication, about the impact and the output, right? Again, we don't want to be, don't make it sound as something that it's not, as in like we have perfect like reporting in established for every project. We know exactly like how much we're affecting the bottom line. Of course not, but we for certain projects, we really very strictly really wanted to get that feedback on a somewhat regular basis, to really show to decision makers that it does really make a difference for the people that ultimately they're also protecting, right? If you speak to head of sales, he doesn't want his sales force to be distracted by this kind of new thing just because it's shiny, but he really wants to know that it makes a difference, for the job, and makes something better. I think that's the one thing. The second one, also with some of the initial projects that I now remember, I think we've been also very careful in about how to actually build trust in the data asset itself. So we really emphasized a lot also in some of key projects in the beginning, the testing aspect, right? To really make field tests. And that I think was very, very important, right? If you say, for instance, well, we want to use basically an algorithm to actually suggest what should be the next point of sales for us to activate, we actually really made some tests and saying, well, that's what the algorithm would say. Or actually, we didn't tell them sometimes what the algorithm would say, but just told them what they would say, and then compared that kind of the human expertise against that output to build that trust. So I think that was also really, really important. Again, just really real life testing with some of these things, and then really about really convincing people and showing senior stakeholders that it actually really made a positive impact on the people that they are ultimately trying to enable.
And that's the trust piece. And you said the next step of that is the communication. So what importance these soft skills play, in terms of influence and persuasion, in terms of building those relationships, both from a budget getting attainment perspective, but also like looking down on the organization and across as well.
Yeah. It's definitely crucial, right? Also, again, here, I think it depends again on your organization, on your readiness, mindset, digital native, not digital. So again, a lot of variables to consider here. And we know that data science, we always talk about this, data kind of translators, right? These roles, and I fully agree that they're super essential. I would also consider that 80% of my job has to do with this. So there's clearly no doubt that this needs to be an essential piece of a data science initiative. But again, it depends on ultimately what is really required to add on to your point, to build that trust, right? And again, in my case, as I said, a lot of my time is really being spent to find, again, that level of communication, to make sure you're not annoying to some of you, because if I write an update to kind of senior decision makers every week, then I'll be like, Jesus. But at the same time, it's also remembering or reminding people why it's still relevant to invest in us. So I think, as I said before, like finding this constant narrative and adapting to the latest organizational dynamics is really, really key, and adapt your communication also to that. And yeah, I think in our case now, 8 years in, it seems like we have found, or people have found the trust, basically the way we communicate, because clearly it's working. But also here, we're learning constantly, right? I'm discussing also with my team and with my boss, of course, what can we do better next year to make sure that we are still as relevant. And that doesn't, as I said before, always mean do more, right? It's just being in the right moments and saying the right things, which I think is ultimately the key about communication. Yeah.
And I don't want to spin your words too much, because what I'm about to say might come across as adversarial, but it's almost like choosing your battle when you talk about the narrative being the war, but also obviously taking the adversarial aspect out of that, because it is all about collaboration, right? And you don't want to force anything on someone, and because it's not going to help in the long run. It's not objectively a good strategy to do that. Do you think that humility plays a big part in these conversations?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think one of the key skills ultimately when you try to kind of build kind of something that is really new, right? So ultimately we're talking about the capability and organizational capability that is in a non-Dutch native environment hasn't existed most likely 10 years ago. Let's put it this way. And I think you really have to be careful as in how you position what you're bringing to the table, right? And you need to be very careful not to overstep your boundaries also. And then of course, like when you're young and you're motivated and you kind of, you also have all this great talent that basically can do anything from, let's say, analytics to engineering. You need to be careful that you don't overstep again going to areas, because there's so many gray areas, of course, attached to our work, that you still also let other people's, have become part of this initiative, not to become a very lonely, isolated initiative, with the risk at some point being buried in the cellar, or someone, a key decision maker, before it even has grown, before it even has shown the value add to organization, kind of kills the whole thing. So I think that kind of humbleness is super super important, as in, like, know what you can do, and know what you're really good at, being very good about expressing that, also stand up for it. So if it's challenged, also like make sure you also like kind of fight your corner, but at the same time also let other people's in, and also acknowledge that there's certain skills that most likely are not best suited to sit with you, again, given your organizational structure, where it's maybe it's also better, let's just look for collaboration than actually owning that skill. And in our case, it has been a key asset, I think, in the way we communicate, in the way we actually also build collaboration frameworks, especially with IT, around that kind of humbleness of knowing, look, of course, we think we're amazing, we're doing a great job, and we have the best people, but at the same time, there are also a lot of really good people and a lot of established roles and processes out there that you need ultimately, and that potentially need to be reshaped a bit to fully enable data science, but they in many occasions exist in organization and need to also like bring them on board. So absolutely important. Yeah.
And I think what you were touching on there was the opposite end of, or not the opposite end, but you also have to have an element of assertiveness about it as well, because you know that the skills that you and your team are bringing to the organization are going to change it for the better. And if you're talking about breaking down silos, what are some of the strategies that you might use to do that if it becomes an issue?
Yeah. So what we've done is, I can speak quite openly to that again, especially with IT, which I think is our most important, let's say, partner in crime here. By now, I would call it a partner in crime, maybe in the past not. It's really looking for this like regular touch points, right? So what we've done is really over the years, we always do some sort of what we call a retreat, where basically we lock ourselves up for a couple of days to really talk very openly, what's going on, what's not working. And I think these kind of touch points have been really essential in kind of building that trust and really kind of also breaking up that silos and bringing these people on board. And that really has now gone so far that really like we share resources, again, with very regular touch points. Again, many things too where we don't agree, of course, which is completely fine. But I think it's really about, again, also going to your point of communication, it's really about like creating these moments of exchange that I think are just really, really essential. And again, in these moments of exchange, not only express what you want and what you need, but also kind of show, as you said, humility, but also acknowledge where also other skills that you don't have and you don't want to have in your organization necessarily, or in your department, how those are essential actually to make you successful, right? So I think it's really creating those spaces is definitely something that I would argue should come from the department or the new kids on the block. So I think this is really like our kind of our duty to kind of ask for those touch points, create those touch points, create that trust, because we're the ones that actually joined the party the latest, right? So I think that is key.
Yeah, and just touching on all of these skills, trust, building good communication skills, humility, and everything like that. What role did these skills play in your success as a professional during your career? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, because again, as I said, like my career was really definitely not like, planned to be, becoming somewhat of a data science expert or like a leader in this space. But I do believe, of course, that, many experiences that I had, colorful experiences. So I've been traveling a lot, working in many countries, studied abroad, etc. That definitely also kind of, prepared me most likely beyond this kind of some sort of technical, like at least knowledge or like appreciation, that are now key. And I think also why I was chosen to kind of, have this role potentially to kind of, grow this, let's put it this way. So yes, I hope they've helped. But again, also I want to be also very open. I don't think that everything I've done is perfect, right? And surely there have been moments where I should have shown more humility and I didn't. And maybe there were moments where I should have been also like more adamant about wanting something. So I'm not saying that I did everything perfectly at all. But I do believe that these skills, did play a role for sure. Now, I think when you think of, and I think that's kind of potentially the point of your question, like how can we isolate some of these skills ultimately, right? We train people to become better at this. And when I look back like 10 years ago, there were no real data science masters or anything available, right? Or really studies in AI in that sense. That is, of course, rapidly changing now, right? And like every business school or every university these days, so many of them have now started to also do some of these courses. And what we see there is that when I look at, for instance, where we're situated in Austria, and there's let's say a academic program with which we also like collaborate, and they started doing basically a data science master's 3 years ago, and it was basically just steal back and borrow from existing courses like mathematics, of course, informatics, etc. What we saw in the last years is that really there was a shift, also like adding more and more of these soft things also into the mix. And I think partly also because of the experiences with companies like ours, right? That just also like gave the feedback, look, these guys are technically good or are very good, but also they're lacking kind of this readiness. Can you really put them into an environment where their stakeholder will not be necessarily impressed by the latest and greatest algorithm they can apply, but really about why this makes any difference for them. So I do believe there's a realization that these things need to also be trained, but also here I want to be very careful that I did an MBA myself, and an MBA is fantastic on many levels, but there are also certain things that I think are more important if they're genuine rather than hardly trained. So yes, you can train communication, you can train presentation skills. You can maybe also teach humility, although usually that comes by being slapped in the face at some point in your life. But I do believe ultimately, and that's maybe a point I wanted to make earlier as well, I think what truly makes a difference for a leader in any case is really like some sort of a genuine behavior. And so I don't think there's a silver bullet for the perfect data leader either. It really is about, again, your context and also how you are actually genuine in your intention. So it's really about the how and the why. And if you find a genuine way that people believe that, again, that you're genuine about why you're doing something and the way you're doing something, I think that ultimately will lead to great output. So I also believe that someone else could have been successful in my position. But I think I did a relatively good job in being genuine about my intentions in this organization. Again, very confident, of course, as well, but also genuine. And that's almost more important than just being a fantastic communicator or like being super humble, which, again, as I said, I definitely wasn't always. Does it make sense, Paul, what I'm trying to allude to here?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think some things can be trained, but some things just come more from an honest place.
Yeah, and it comes from, exactly as you just said, it comes from an honest place, right? And here at the Data Storytellers, we work with data leaders, but we've never done MBAs in data science, and we've never worked in big organizations implementing data. From your own personal perspective, outside of the technical side of things, how much utility is there in formal data education in terms of the leadership stuff, do you think?
You mean as in like educating the leadership in general on data?
Yeah, as opposed to the technical stuff, which is obviously you need that
Yes.
you need that anyway, right?
Yes. Well, also here, I think in theory, it's super essential. And again, I'm sorry to be annoying to coming back. It really depends on your context, right? Because I also remember when we kicked off this initiative at Red Bull, I had all the same PowerPoint slides that everyone else had, right? In terms of like what we need to be doing next. We need to prioritize our use cases. We need to actually have a quarterly training session with the leadership team, and talk to them about data science, why it's great and whatnot. And I think they all make sense. They're kind of tools in a toolbox, right? But ultimately, you need to find again what really rocks the boat in your organization. And we really found that if I have to reflect honestly now, like in the past, most likely I would have loved to do kind of a really regular training with our senior leadership, like really formal training around data. But I think what really happened in our organization was more like, because of like finding a good level of communication, of updating them on why it actually adds value to our organization. We actually did it in a certain way, and it wasn't around formalized training, but it's really about, like, again, this trust and showing the impact that it has. And by now we really have touch points regularly with the board, where we update them on that. We ask for, let's say, permission and budget, of course, but there's a lot of trust in us, and they just get that feedback also from their peers that what we're touching usually really adds value by now. So again, I have also many other examples where from colleagues in other companies where they did that formal training, and I think it's amazing, especially if the CEO says, "Look, I want my leadership team to be trained in this. I want to have a session on a regular basis where they get exposed to some of these tools and start thinking in data terms." And that's also fantastic, but it's not always the key to success. I would say, again, it depends really on your organization and the appetite. And again, is it a top-down, bottom-up approach? So there are many tools, and you need to find the right mix for yours.
And you've done a big circle back, which is great, because my next question was actually about bottom-up versus top-down. In your organization, what have you found works better, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah. I mean, clearly, it's a combination of both. I guess most people would say that, but in our personal journey, there was really a lot of effort put in the bottom up approach, which I now retrospectively appreciate a lot. So it was really about. This is also like one of the advantages, maybe if you're in a company that is not public, where you can just build basically some or have some resource available without having to report back necessarily 3 months later. And so they gave a really bit of space, saying like, look, find people that want to work with you, and find basically projects, and then execute them, and then we talk about them in the organization. And I think now 4, 5, 6 years later, these relationships we've built also on that level are now really crucial, because some of these people have moved on. They became now more senior decision makers, and kind of building that really working relationship has been really key. At the same time, however, and that's why it's ultimately both, if you would have been able to also communicate to the board and other senior decision makers, the value that we're bringing, would have had, of course, a much harder time to also like secure budget and secure headcount and etc. Right? So I think you need to find both, but it's really, if any of the two things is out of sync, it usually it doesn't succeed in a sustainable initiative, really, right? So I think you need to again balance these two things, and find the right on an ongoing basis where you should be really focusing on. And I think also here, call it luck, but I think we found a relatively good balance in the two.
Yeah, and I'll give you a pretty good grilling on the organization. We'll go wider in a moment, but one last question I did have on that was, how intentional are you with things like setting clear priorities and building strategic plans and following tactical roadmaps? Do you have a system in place to help you and the team with that prompt and accurate execution?
Yeah. No, very good question. Also here, it's really something, of course, when you mature, right? It's a difference if you're like 3 people or like 100 people, right? So you need to, of course, manage that in a very different way. And I think there's certain things that we're just really forced to do smarter, right? Again, at some point in the beginning, you take on any work, and now we're at the stage where clearly we also need to start saying no, right? So prioritization plays clearly an important role. But also here, we also on purpose, we maintain some sort of flexibility. So we said, like, when we communicate our work, usually we have this kind of 3 pillars where we said, like, 80% is basically spent on developing or rolling out concepts, so stuff that we already kind of solved, and where it's really about like rolling it out into more markets or just making it more robust. The second pillar is then really in like what we call like concept development, so where we have a clear ask, we just don't know yet if and how we can solve it. And there's a bit of also resources dedicated to what we call R&D, right? Like playing around, getting exposed to new technologies or algorithms, etc. And we would say like 70, 20, 10. I would say approximately the way we allocate resources there. Again, also on a year-to-year basis, these things sometimes fluctuate, right? Sometimes like bigger projects become so big that you actually cannot really do a lot of R&D. So also need to kind of balance here as you go along. What we're trying to do more and more is really like emphasize our work around some key initiatives that we really believe really are super relevant, and really like start from there, and then really whatever is left over allocate to the other pieces like new like innovation or concept development and R&D. And of course here, given that we're a bit more mature by now, we're also forced by our senior decision makers to kind of really routinely report on that, right? So what are you doing with your time? What are you working on? And ultimately, then when it comes to actually talking to the board, we need to kind of justify our narrative and also show how we've kind of spent our resources against which kind of initiatives. But also, luckily, there we managed kind of well communicating that you cannot manage data science completely the same way you would actually manage necessarily an IT portfolio, if that makes sense. So there needs to be some room for flexibility, right? And some room for failure, some room for iteration, experimentation. And luckily we've created also that understanding that it's not that every year we're completely held, but that's what you said and you didn't do it. Of course, when it would be a big initiative that wouldn't go down well, but there's also still some flexibility about what we can do on a yearly basis, and also priorities, organizational priorities change. And this is for us more important that we're relevant for the people that need to make decisions in a certain period and support that, rather than just sticking to a plan necessarily. But again, it's always a bit of a mix, and we need to also mature and become more structured and also present our business plan and defend it. Yeah.
And everyone does, right? And talking from a more wider context now, I imagine you speak to leaders in data science pretty regularly outside of your organization. How do you see data analytics today? What do you think about the state of data functions in organizations and the general progress of these data-driven business transformations in a corporate context?
Yeah, so also here, I think it depends a lot, like most likely who you ask. Again, like if you speak to someone like Google or speak to us, right? So we need to kind of also, as always, make a differentiation there. And I want to rather speak about this non-digital native environments, because that's what I know more about. But I do believe there is kind of, if I may say, I do believe there's a bit of a hype that is over, and I mean it in a very good way. That was kind of my impression that I had in the last years. Is really this kind of data science is kind of the silver bullet for everything, or AI, and I feel is calming down a bit, which I think is very, very good and very, very healthy. So it's really more about like pragmatically leveraging this this technology and data roles in organization, rather than like just doing something flashy. At least that's something we realize, and luckily we've survived this hype period very well. Actually, we're bigger than ever in that sense, but I think we managed it that pretty good. But I do believe there's this kind of maybe we should focus more on blockchain. This is really the new cool thing, rather than like data science and AI, and I'm happy about that. But I do believe that what's also happening is that there's still a lot of confusion about what these different data roles really are, what they should be doing, what skills they need, and how they really all interact, right? And it's really, for me, this kind of engineering, data science, and analysts, right, are kind of three roles where I think there's still a lot of confusion around what is what, right? And I think it's also something that we're very careful about, like when we communicate about postings and job roles, to really make it very clear what we believe these people are doing, right? So I mean, there's nothing. I think it happens all the time that someone applies for a data science position, but ultimately just does analyst work. He's actually applying for a data scientist position, but he's then working as an engineer, and that's fantastic, and that's all needed, right? But sometimes the communication around these roles is still not clear and still also understood within the organization. And here also we need to do a lot of work because we have realized that we depend on both sides, right? So yes, in the middle you could call it data science, but then we need these engineering skills and you need these analysts that ultimately work with your data products. And if these things are not somewhat in sync and also clearly defined, then the gray areas cause a lot of confusion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you don't have the right people in data engineering, then the data science team is going to suffer as a result of that, right? And as you've said rightly throughout the whole podcast, that the whole organization is going to suffer as a result of that, because it makes
Totally.
it makes your message less clear or less powerful, which is the key as well. So you did touch on technology there, but what do you think are the greatest opportunities for ambitious companies and leaders today? Let's say in non-diginative.
I think one of the and I'm just gonna very very sneakily make a challenge into an opportunity here, or vice versa, but. So one of the things that I really see is, as I said, like this really finding this narrative and this enablement together with IT and really identify and define these new processes that are needed to also like bring value on an ongoing basis of these data products to the organization, right? And luckily we've built here some collaboration frameworks already, how we deploy things, etc. But I truly believe that there's massive steps that can still be made also in our organization to make these things just a bit more smarter, make them more like really collaborative and more seamless and like really across the different functions independently from where you sit. I think it's ultimately needed to really be smart about how to deploy your resources and use data assets to bring this value to the organization. And I do believe that this is really something that is not only in our organization, but it's something that is really across the board, even also most likely in digital native organizations, but definitely non-digital native organizations, how to really break up those silos, to use one of the terms you used before, and really see like how can we do things now differently. Most likely we need to do things a bit differently when we think about deploying these data assets. What are the roles that we need? Again, what are the platforms we need? What are the processes that we need to kind of keep these living things basically relevant and alive? I think there I see a massive opportunity to really kind of also for non-digital native companies become more digitally aware and digitally enabled. And that's something that personally really excites me, and that's also where my humbleness comes in, where I'm very much also appreciating, the support of our IT counterparts, because that's really expertise that of course we always have great ideas and we have some understanding and see some flashy stuff, but we want to really be very pragmatic here and very humble also with our IT counterparts, what is potentially needed to make this happen. Being also aware that also means, again, defining new processes, which is, again, not an easy thing, right? That's where your transformational aspect comes in. How do you convince senior decision makers that potentially we need to be doing things differently? We need new roles, etc., just for this data stuff. And that's something that, again, is a challenge, but at the same time, I think it's a massive opportunity as well that I'm really looking forward to solving, hopefully.
Yes, and Manuel, I've had a really great discussion today. It's been really good to hear your own perspective, and you've definitely been doing this for a while, and I wouldn't be surprised if we have you on the show again down the line. Last question then. So what advice would you give for aspiring leaders in data?
Again, I'm not going to say too many new things here, which I haven't mentioned before, but the more I think about it, it's really about the key vision that I have for a good data leader is ultimately still, and that's almost something I would say for any leader, is really like this being genuine about who you are. So I don't think it's about picking up like certain skills necessarily, because again, the reason why you're ending up to be a leader depends on the context and your career, etc. But I do believe that if you find a genuine narrative about your intentions, that is going to be a key enabler for your success. It's, again, the why and the how, like how you do things and why you do them. And if you really you establish that kind of narrative around yourself as a person, as a leader, and are perceived as a genuine with genuine intentions, then I think that can go a very, very long way. And it can really make a difference. And I wouldn't dare to say how exactly that is, what that is. But I have seen people that are completely different in terms of, like, also to me as a data leader, in terms of personality, maybe sometimes much more technical, less outgoing, less outspoken. Yet they also have been as successful as I'm, for sure. But I think it's also because they were perceived, again, as a very genuine, with genuine intentions. So I think this is really what I would really emphasize. And then really it's really to a certain degree also. I think you can plan for certain things. I think you can prepare yourself for certain things, but certain things happen with luck. And what I mean by that is, where opportunity and preparation meet. And in terms of preparation, it's really about just looking into the mirror, what you ultimately really want to do. Do you want to become more technical expert? And it's very clear what you should be doing in your more junior career, right? Really focus a lot on those technical skills. I would always say, like, really have a fantastic, like, sound background in statistics and mathematics, of course, and ideally research. But if you think, well, I also want to kind of, aspire to be some sort of a manager in the space, which again, also not every data scientist wants to be a manager. Then maybe you should also focusing on, like, really understanding some business processes, right? And work a bit on that communication skill for sure. So these things are obvious, but I think that the first point that I mentioned, potentially not, right? Find really a genuine narrative around you and make sure people perceive you, that you're genuine in your intentions. And I think that goes a long way.
Great advice there. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Manuel. And we'll be in touch soon, I'm sure.
Thank you, Paul. It was a pleasure speaking to you. And yeah, I hope we speak soon again. Have a good one.